In the following demonstration, we shall describe procedures for welding a butt joint. For purposes of the exercise, we will weld 2 pieces of 3 mm mild steel plate. The weld zone of both pieces must be ground and cleaned to remove all traces of oxides and other substances, and your workpieces laid out upon a clean welding bench. We must next set a root gap between the 2 plates. A root gap provides a gap into which the weld can penetrate. The width of the root gap should be equivalent to the filler wire diameter, which in our example is 2.4 mm. A piece of spare filler wire, bent in the manner demonstrated, makes a handy gauge. Your TIG power source and equipment is set up and prepared using the same settings as used in the previous exercise. Next, we shall tack weld the plates together. Tack welds are temporary welds used to hold pieces together and maintain alignment during the main welding process. 3 tacks are required on our exercise. The first tack should be made in the center of the join. An arc is struck to one side of the root gap and then drawn into the root. Filler is then introduced into the weld pool. The tack weld must be treated like any other weld, and to avoid porosity, it is important that the shielding gas is maintained over the weld pool whilst it cools. A short weld, around 4 to 5 mm long, is sufficient. When the tack weld cools, the root gap may alter due to contraction of the weld. Check that the gap is uniform, and if necessary, make small adjustments, as demonstrated, to realign the plates. When you are satisfied that the gap is parallel, then tack welds can be made at both ends in the manner just explained. The next thing we shall do is to introduce a preset to the joint. In effect, we will deliberately bend back the plates at the join so that as the weld cools and contracts, the plates will pull into a flat condition. The preset is made, as demonstrated, by turning your work over and resting one section on a spare practice plate. A few hammer blows along the unsupported section will result in bending back the joint sufficiently for the preset. For the main weld, we shall place the work on a raised welding jig so as to avoid the possibility of having the work fuse to the surface of the bench. The arc will be struck inside the plate and then drawn back to the edge of the joint where the weld pool will be formed. As soon as the weld pool has developed across the root gap, filler wire is introduced in exactly the same manner that you learnt in the previous exercise. The filler wire must be held so that it is in line with the joint and at 15 to 20 degrees to the surface of the work. Let's look at this in live action. The arc is struck and the weld pool is created at the edge of the plates. Filler wire must be fed steadily into the weld pool in order to fill the root gap. You will see evenly spaced C-shaped ripples building up behind the nozzle as the weld progresses forward. When you reach a tacking weld, simply continue the welding action through the tack. Do not jump over the tack, as the weld pool will freeze if you do this. Remember that as the weld progresses, you will need to control the heat as you learnt earlier. At the end of the run, break the arc in the appropriate manner according to the equipment being used, and hold the nozzle over the weld until the gas cuts off. Finally, after the work has cooled, inspect the weld. A good weld will have the following features: a uniform width of bead of between 6 and 8 mm with no signs of porosity along the full length of the joint, uniformly spaced ripples indicating good control of the filler wire, and on the reverse side of the weld you should see a narrow bead which indicates that there has been full penetration of filler into the root.